Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Finance Friday. I'm Hard Money Jim, and I'm speaking once again from beautiful Coronado, California, where the sun shines every day and gas is still well above $6 a gallon. But we're not going to talk about too much, at least, about inflation today, but there's another important money topic that ultimately is going to have, I think, far-reaching effects on you and me and all of us, as I believe we will discover today. And today, I would like to talk about the status of the US dollar as a reserve currency. And so I'm calling this Banks and the Dollar, Government's New Favorite Weapon. Government's new favorite weapon. So I'd like to open up this discussion, if I can get my slides to work here, with a quote from someone who really understands the dollar as reserve currency and the dollar as a weapon, and that's Vladimir Putin. This is a quote from a speech that he made back in October 2018 to a energy trade group. And he was discussing at the time the sanctions that the US was putting on Iran and Venezuela. And this is what he said. He said, "It seems to me that our American partners are making a colossal mistake as they undermine the credibility of the dollar as a universal and the only reserve currency today. They are undermining faith in it. They really are taking a saw to the branch that they are sitting in." So Russia had already at this time been trying to move away from dependence on the dollar as reserve currency. And Putin understood what was happening. He's a brutal despot, Putin is, and a murderer. He deserves our condemnation, no doubt. But we should not underestimate his intelligence and his understanding. The so-called weaponization of the dollar has important implications for the future of international politics and economics, and on all of us. I mean, we have all benefited from the use of the dollar as a common currency especially since the end of the Cold War. We've had lots of financial cooperation that's fostered trade and prosperity and capitalism and peace. And this kind of commercial interdependency that developed among nations all made us more prosperous, and we all benefited from it. But increasingly now it seems like the financial system has become a bit of a battleground. And the willingness of the USA government to use the banking system and the dollar as a weapon is going to affect all of us significantly in the years to come. So to explain what I mean by this, I need to basically do three things today. We need to answer three questions. And first, we have to understand that international trade and finance mechanisms rely on the US dollar as the dominant reserve currency. So we have to understand what that term reserve currency means and why the dollar is the most used currency. Okay, now second, we should understand how US authorities are using the banking system to weaponize the dollar. In other words, to place economic sanctions excuse me, on our enemies in order to limit their economic freedom of action. And to answer this, this question, we're going to ask, what is it about our money and banking system, this system of pure credit creation that I talk about all the time? What is it about this system that gives the US government the ability to use the dollar as a weapon? And then third, we need to understand what these recent financial sanctions these actions will cost, and what are the consequences both to the enemies we're trying to restrict, but everyone else. What are the effects on everyone else? Okay, so what does reserve currency mean? Well, a reserve currency is just a foreign currency or a precious metal that's held by governments, usually at their central banks, or by other large quasi-government institutions. And it's used for as a means of payment, international payment and investment, and sometimes, probably most often, to support domestic currencies. The US dollar has been the main reserve currency since 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement. We're going to talk about that just a little bit later. Not too much, but a little bit. But since the rise of prosperity and trade, other strong economic nations have been able to position their currencies as reserve currencies too. And so we're speaking now of the euro, the yen, the renminbi, which is the Chinese currency, and the pound sterling. Okay, so just to concretize it, let's first look at this. You can see from this chart here, about 60% of the national currencies held as reserves, as foreign exchange reserves, are US dollars. And the euro is a pretty distant second. So this tells you the US dollar really is the dominant reserve currency. How do countries use their reserve currencies? Well, the best way to, I think, is to give you an example. For example, China uses it to peg the value of its currency, the renminbi. And they peg it in relation to the US dollar. They price it, they try to price it in the US dollar. So here's how that works. A Chinese merchant will sell goods to a US importer, and in payment, he will take dollars. Now he has dollars in a bank account. Next, the Chinese central bank, who doesn't want his merchant to hold dollars, buys or exchanges those dollars for newly printed renminbi. Now, this is if this sounds familiar, this is the Chinese version of mouse click money, money that's made up in a bank account. It's kind of their version of QE. So now the Chinese central bank has dollars, and they invest those dollars in US treasuries. And the Chinese today, this has been going on many years, they use this system to keep their currency exchange rate lower than it might otherwise be in order to facilitate export surpluses. And in doing this, the Chinese have built up a war chest, if you could call it that, of $3.2 trillion that they hold in US treasuries. That's second only to the Fed in terms of any single institution that holds US treasuries. So this has been their policy for decades, and Japan, of course, has done similar things. Other things that countries can do with their reserve currencies: they can maintain liquidity in a crisis, they can meet their basic international obligations to other banks in other countries, they can fund internal projects if their internal currency is not seen as strong enough. They can just reassure foreign investors that they have the wherewithal to make payments in support of their home currency, and they can just diversify their portfolios with it. So that gives you, I think, an overview of why or how what a reserve currency is. Now I've got this chart from the Financial Times, which shows that the US dollar, in terms of international payments, is responsible, and this is from 2021, is responsible for over 40% of all transactions, followed not too far behind by the euro. So you really can see that the dollar really is the currency that people want to hold most and use the most. And that's the same question. They hold the dollar or securities denominated in dollars because they want to use dollars. And so why? Why is the dollar the most used currency? And so now I would like to show you that the dollar is the most used currency because it is the most marketable currency. Just as gold developed from barter as the most marketable commodity. There are very good parallels to both these situations that I think will give you some insight. So you know that money evolved from barter. This is the standard Austrian economics origin of money thesis. And as barter developed, the more saleable or marketable barter goods were often held in storage for later trade because they were more useful in a later trade. For example, suppose you live in a society where the main things traded are grain and furs and fish. Which of those three would you rather hold in reserve for a later trade? Well, you'd probably want to hold grain because unlike fish, it won't spoil at least not as quick. And unlike furs, it's more divisible and more precisely measured to trade for just about anything else. So as barter develops even further, you would rather hold gold for further trade for the same reason. It's more durable, it's divisible, it's desirable, it's scarce. It can always be traded. In short, it's the most marketable commodity. Eventually, gold becomes widely used as money, which then gives it additional marketability because the more widely it's used for money, the better it works as money. Okay, so for details on that, you can see Carl Menger, The Origins of Money. Some of you might be familiar with that already. Well, so now, just as the most marketable among competing commodities eventually becomes money, in the same way, the most marketable among competing currencies becomes the reserve currency. And so now let me explain this a little bit, because it's a little bit different from the pure historical explanation of why the dollar is the world's reserve currency, which I think is not true. The dollar's climb to the top of the currency heap was not because, as some assume, of the privilege that was bestowed upon the US when it was predominant in winning World War II. Now, at the end of World War II, 1944, toward the end, we had the Bretton Woods Agreement, which pegged the dollar at $35 an ounce of gold, and it made the dollar the world's reserve currency. And that means if you held dollars, they were supposedly as good as gold. They were convertible to gold. And the Bretton Woods Agreement was finally formally adopted in 1958, but it fell apart in 1971 because the USA printed too much money and had to devalue the dollar relative to gold. So this was a default on the promise of convertibility. And then finally, in 1973, the US government abandoned gold convertibility altogether. And yet, despite that failure, and despite that default, the dollar not only survived, but it became an even more dominant, more widely used reserve currency. So how and why, despite this failure of Bretton Woods, did the dollar remain the world's reserve currency? And to answer that, my answer, I'm going to ask you kind of an off-the-wall question. In a prison community, cigarettes become just like money. They're the most marketable commodity in that community. And why is this? That's the question I want to ask. Why is this? Not everyone's a smoker, but enough people do smoke that you're always just a few trades away from trading your cigarettes to a smoker for something else that he has that you find valuable. And this is, believe it or not, very similar to the adoption of the dollar. The dollar became the world's reserve currency and stayed that way because you could buy practically anything with it in America, within the American geographical economy. The dollar had huge advantages that made it highly marketable. First, there are the security advantages, meaning by that, I mean security of property rights. For example, you could confidently buy or build a business anywhere in the 50 states, guaranteed by constitutional law. You could live in peace. You had fair laws. You had honest police. You had a strong military that would protect you from invasion. These are all things that come with good property rights. And in addition, and very importantly, where the dollar was the monopoly currency within the US, there were opportunity advantages. Within America's boundaries all by itself, all alone, the dollar's geographical reach and diversity are enormous. The size and the variety of things that you can buy with dollars in America are unmatched anywhere. And ethnicity or religion or gender does not exclude you from those opportunities. Now, over time, confidence in US markets and the dollar used to, trade in those markets generates confidence in the currency, which generates confidence in trade, which generates more trade. And it's kind of an unbroken circle. And then over time, the dollar's near universal access to wealth in the US made it the most marketable currency in history as this marketability gradually extended to the entire world. People in remote locations would accept dollars because even if they did not intend to actually buy something American themselves, there were always millions of others who would and could. So in many respects, this is like cigarettes in a prison, right? Everyone in the world wanted American dollars for the same reason that millions of foreign citizens want to immigrate to America. The possibilities and the opportunities in America seemed endless. And why did Chinese oligarchs to this day want to trade their renminbi for dollars? So they can buy condos in San Francisco and send their children to USA colleges. Because the outcome of spending or investing their dollars in the USA is better than the outcome of spending their renminbi in China because of the limitations on both the security of property and the opportunity to invest their money and consume. Now, the same conditions that made the dollar attractive have never been true of the Chinese renminbi or the Russian ruble or even the Swiss franc. There are no property rights in China to speak of, no official ones anyway. Russian law enforcement is corrupt, and you can't buy oceanfront property in Switzerland. So even though Switzerland may have good property rights, you're very limited in what you can do with the money in Switzerland. And I would add to this that a free and dependable banking system is always has been a big part of the dollar's appeal, because a reliable banking system increases the dollar's marketability. Any banking restrictions, on the other hand, including the freezing of accounts, will undermine the desirability of the dollar. See how we're doing on time? We're good. Okay. So that is my explanation for why the dollar is the most desired and the most dominant reserve currency. It's because of where the dollar resides in the USA and all the institutions that go with the USA. The next question is, how do governments use the economic strength of the dollar to weaponize it? And what really gives the government the power to do that. Now, I think you know the U.S. recently imposed what seems to be pretty severe sanctions on Russia. And one of the main sanctions is to deny them the use of their dollar reserves by freezing their bank accounts, their U.S. bank accounts. And that includes freezing the accounts owned by the Russian central bank. Now, it's been pretty easy to cut them off from their banking money, but it's not always that easy. In doing some research for this little presentation, I learned that during the Crimean War, that's this painting here, which took place in 1854 to 1856, obviously on land that is now the Ukraine. Britain, France, and Russia fought these horrible battles in what is now Ukraine, and hundreds of thousands of people died on both sides. And yet, throughout it all, the British Treasury kept paying its debts to the Tsarist government, and Russia kept paying interest to the British owners of its sovereign debt. It was unthinkable for these governments to declare financial war on each other, even though their soldiers were killing each other. Now, there were good reasons for this. Back in 1854, the international reserve currency was gold. If gold is the reserve currency, and no single nation can issue that reserve currency, all nations basically must bow to gold financially. Governments were dependent on the banks, and banks were dependent on gold depositors. Gold depositors were the owners of the gold. The failure of a sovereign government to pay its debts would result in a run on the gold deposits of the bank. So remember, reserves in those days were controlled by the owners of gold, the depositors of gold, not by governments. Unlike today's money, gold, which was the reserve currency, was not created by the bank, and it did not need a banking system to be money. It was independent of the banking system. The market, not government, was the monetary authority. But today, all currencies are the product of pure credit creation. And this credit creation exists at the pleasure of a sovereign government. Governments authorize banks to create money. Government and not the market is the monetary authority. So, the government authorizes a bank to create a ledger entry, a bank deposit, and that is used as money. And that means the government can effectively wipe out that ledger if it wants to for any political purpose. Money today is the made-up liability of a bank, and that liability exists only because the government says it can. So it's easy for government to just tell the bank, nullify that liability, nullify that money, just cross it out. It's just a ledger entry. So I know I'm beating this up, but this is the key point. It is the current system of fiat money, a system of pure credit creation, that permits nations to weaponize their banking systems. Without government control over money creation and money transfer, that would not be possible. And this is why here at Hard Money Jim, where I try to explore money creation and its consequences, this is why I'm so interested in this topic of government sanctions. Banking sanctions like this are possible because banks create the money and they hold the money, and banks exist only by legal permission that are tightly regulated. When government orders banks to close accounts, banks have to comply, even if the pretext for that action is, very questionable. All right, so for sure now, government willingness to weaponize its banking system is on the rise. And we've seen this both on a large scale and a small scale. Now, before I get into this next session, maybe I'll want to pause for a minute and ask, do we have any super chat questions or comments, Daniel, that I should address?
Yes, we have a comment from Jonathan Honig. Thank you for $5. Bonds are getting absolutely smoked. That's his comment. And then we also have a question from Stephen Lamb. Thank you for your $5. When are you having Elizabeth Warren on as a guest to tell us what we should really do about all this inflation?
Oh, well, Jonathan, thanks for reminding us. Yeah, bonds are getting smoked like no other time in my 35, maybe it's longer than that now, my 40-year career in finance. I have never seen anything like this. We are already, the bond indexes are already down 7%, and that this year, and that is already the worst year in history, at least since we have bond indexes. And as far as Elizabeth Warren goes, oh my gosh, wouldn't that be fun? Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. I would look forward to that, which would never happen. All right, so let's talk about, and by the way, thank you both for your support and your comments. Now, government's willingness to weaponize the banking system is not brand new. A great example of abuse of weaponizing banks. Do you remember something called Operation Choke Point under the Obama administration? This occurred from 2013 to 2017. And this was where the Justice Department was just shutting down bank accounts of legal businesses that it didn't like. And that included legal businesses, fireworks dealers, gambling sites, pornography sites, payday loan sites, gun dealers, and others. And this program ended only in 2017 after Congress, change of government, after Congress and bank regulators and so forth pressured the Justice Department to stand down. And this was definitely an example of abuse of domestic sanctions. But another example is recently when Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, invoked the Canada's Emergencies Act and deprived the Canadian truckers of access to their bank accounts. And even contributors to the truckers' cause were blocked retroactively, meaning that a perfectly legal contribution was deemed illegal after the fact. And access to that money was temporarily blocked without any due process. Now, I know that was Canada, not the USA, but it was very close, it was too close to home for me. So, these banking sanctions have been compared to, big tech canceling someone because it didn't approve of their content. But, canceling a bank account is actually much worse than that. It's real coercion because no one can live without money, and money is a bank account today. And I just want to quote a friend of mine, Todd Zawicki from the Cato Institute. He was talking about this on a Stossel interview recently, and he gave a really good example to underscore how important it is that government can control your bank account. He says, imagine if during the civil rights era, Martin Luther King could have lost his bank account because he trespassed at a Woolworths counter. Imagine if people who may have donated as little as $20 to King's cause may not have been able to access their bank accounts. Now, I'm old enough to remember this well. You may be surprised to hear Martin Luther King was not universally popular at the time. The FBI didn't like him very much. So that should chill you right there. All right, so governments are increasingly willing to use the banking system as a weapon for sure. And now this is being applied to Russia. So here we are, the dollar's king, and Uncle Sam's sort of eagerness to weaponize the dollar by canceling bank accounts is sort of front and center in US policy. Now, internationally, this is not completely new. The US has historically used its authority to freeze the bank accounts of bad actors like North Korea and Cuba and Iran and Venezuela. But I am calling its its recent action against Russia is sort of the mother of all banking sanctions. And besides closing U.S. banks to Vladimir Putin and his oligarch buddies, as of February 28th, the U.S. authorities the Treasury Department has closed the U.S. dollar accounts of the Russian central bank. There is a photo of the facade of the Russian central bank. This has denied the Bank of Russia access to its foreign reserves, and the ones that are held in U.S. banks. And this action basically says to Russia, the money that is owed in terms of bonds and securities that you hold, and that is recorded in our banks, is now null and void because the U.S. government says so. The immediate effect of this was to prevent the Bank of Russia from using its reserves to prop up its currency, the ruble, which fell by 30% and has now largely recovered. Now, undoubtedly, this created and still creates some hardship for Russia, but will these penalties convince Putin to stand down, to stop his invasion of the Ukraine? Will it cause, so much economic pain to the Russian people that they'll blame him and rise up and throw him out? I would say that's unlikely because similar sanctions on minor countries like Cuba and Iran and Venezuela and North Korea have never been able to dislodge the tyrants there. So whether those bank sanctions hurt Vladimir Putin a little or a lot, they're going to have far-reaching effects on many innocent people, and not only those in Russia. And to understand, consider what happens when a bank account is frozen. Now, I hope you can follow this. I just wanted to hammer this point home. In today's monetary system, almost all money consists of just a ledger entry in a bank. So if Bill sells wheat to Joe, the transaction I show on the left there, it's not as simple as Joe just handing money over to Bill in most cases, and Bill handing wheat over to Joe. There's almost always a third party involved, and the third party that exists at the pleasure of the government. So what really happens in most cases is Joe pays for the wheat by instructing his bank to reduce the numbers in his account and increase the numbers in Bill's account. So we cross out the liability to Joe and increase the bank's liability to Bill. So when a bank regulator or a judge orders a bank to stop taking instructions from the account owner, they say, hey, don't take instructions from Joe anymore. All money movement stops, and that account is frozen. Money today is almost all bank deposits. Transferring money is almost always a transfer of ownership from ownership of a bank deposit. And transactions simply cannot happen if banks will not or cannot execute the orders of their depositors. Now, freezing these bank accounts this way does not just harm the owner of the account. Many others also suffer in at least two ways. First, the community loses the benefit of any productive economic services provided by the target of that action. And second, if customers perceive that the government's shutdown is arbitrary or heavy-handed, that's going to have a chilling effect on trust in the bank. After all, if the government can freeze your account for no good reason, it can do the same to mine. Now, those effects apply equally to both foreign and domestic customers of US banks. In the case of Russia, the impossibility of confining the costs of the shock to the enemy, it just makes the freezing of the accounts and activity worth considering. Meaning, in other words, we can't confine the effects of the frozen assets just to the Russian government. So, Putin and his oligarchs are not going to be the only casualties of bank account warfare. Legitimate Russian businesses, for example, which supply much of the world's oil and fertilizer and grain and metals, will no longer be able to use a dollar-based banking system. And their customers, tens of millions of people in Europe and Africa and India, will no longer be able to buy and sell Russian goods priced in dollars. Both buyers and sellers will need to find an alternate payment system in order to survive in business. Now, Joe Biden seems confident that the dollar's dominance will allow his sanctions to work, but every time you use the banking system to force the hand of someone who depends on it, you cast doubt on whether that system is valuable to them or not, and they're going to look for an alternative. In other words, you can use the dollar and the banks as a hammer, but if you swing too hard, you risk breaking the hammer. Now, are the sanctions working? This is just in from Bloomberg this morning. Quote, as Europe prepares to join the US in hitting the Kremlin with tighter sanctions for its war on Ukraine, there are plenty of signs that Russia is finding ways to prop up its economy. I'll just paraphrase here. Cargoes of Russian crude oil from the Far East have sold out for next month. Several Chinese firms are using local currency to buy Russian coal. Gas flows from Russia to Europe have, if anything, increased since the invasion on February 24th. None of these, by the way, are subject of restrictions. Bloomberg Economics expects Russia will earn about $320 billion from energy exports this year, up by more than a third from 2021. Now, 2021 was partly a pandemic year, but also partly a recovery year. So that's significant. The ruble has already rebounded to its pre-war price against the dollar. Russian crude that would normally end up in refineries in Europe or the US is headed for Asia, where buyers, particularly in India, are taking advantage of steep discounts. Shipments from the Black Sea and Russia's Baltic Sea ports have started heading into India. I mean, it sounds like the sanctions are weak at best. So pretty clearly, both our enemies and our friends are adjusting to this new weaponization of the dollar, and they'll continue to adjust. But if it continues, what kind of long-run effects should we, we're just good guys in America and the UK, us on this call. We're just trying to make a living and trade, freely and honestly. What effects should we expect to see? How will it affect us? Well, first of all, I think we should expect a decline, but not complete demise of the dollar's reserve currency status. I must say, all the calls about the imminent demise of the dollar as reserve currency, I think, are far-fetched. This will not happen overnight. It will be gradual, but things should change. And this process of change is already underway. According to the Wall Street Journal, China and Saudi Arabia are discussing payment for oil in the Chinese renminbi. China already buys more than 25% of Saudi Arabia's oil. And if they price that in renminbi, those sales would boost the standing of China's currency. Now, that would be a radical move if they actually do this, because since 1974, all of Saudi Arabia's oil sales have been in US dollars. This may be related to why Saudi Arabia is not taking President Biden's call anymore. And some people, experts at Goldman Sachs, even think the Russians and Chinese will try to invent their own new reserve currency backed by commodities and gold. Now, I suspect that given the state of the economies and property rights in those countries, that will be harder than they think, but they'll give it a try. Now, so first point, expect the dollar to come to some, at least minor bit of demise as world reserve currency. Second, definitely, I would say, expect higher interest rates. This is to Jonathan's point about the bond market blowing up. And I think you may be seeing more than just the Fed deciding they're not going to buy bonds anymore. Currently, China holds a massive $3.2 trillion of US Treasuries as a result of the big trading surplus. But why should they keep US Treasuries if the US might at some point prohibit converting those into cash? Russia has already sold down, before this crisis, already sold down most of its Treasury bonds, and replacing its foreign reserves with gold and other currencies. China could be the next big seller of Treasury bonds, and that would pressure interest rates higher. All right, third thing, expect higher prices for everything. Let me come back to that other slide there. Expect higher prices for everything. This is a graph of the items in the consumer price index that respond quickly to changes in supply and demand. On the supply side, on the side of supply of goods, you can expect that the move toward non-dollar payment systems is going to affect and impair the international division of labor. The efficiency and productivity that's been accumulated over the decades of liberalized trade and international cooperation and the use of the dollar are going to have to suffer as countries join in these smaller trading blocs that are insulated by their currencies and sort of separate bilateral agreements. As those trading structures change, some supply chains will change, and as they change, some will fail before they're rebuilt, and that will result in occasional shortages. It's basically the efficiency of just in time is going to have to yield somewhat to the security of just in case as people hold more inventories, hoarding, which is rational. You can basically expect upward pressure on commodity and manufactured good prices, just given the time required to adjust to new supply chains and demand patterns. And again, this just in from Bloomberg, global food prices are surging at the fastest pace ever as the war in Ukraine chokes crop supplies. You can see there that Russia and Ukraine count for something like 25% of all the world exports of wheat. The United Nations Index of World Costs went up 13%, a record increase last month. That's year over year. This may back off as the war ends, but expect prices to spike, recover somewhat, and then stay high. That's if you want a prediction, that's what I would say. Now, on the demand side, on the money demand side, what would any of my presentations be without my money supply graph? On the demand side, excess money creation is going to slow down, at least for a while, but eventually it will likely continue and fuel higher prices. You're well aware, if you've been nice enough to attend any of my presentations or read any of my Substack pieces, you're well aware of the tsunami of money that was released during this pandemic, what I call pandemic QE. Now, money printing on that scale will slow down, but it can't stop entirely because the US cannot avoid monetizing its growing national debt and its growing national obligations. All right. So slow down, but not decrease. Fourth, expect some reshoring, I would call it, of some jobs and industries that were previously outsourced to other countries. And this, I think, will probably be mainly, at first at least, strategic items to protect the defense industry. For example, key semiconductors should probably be built in the USA rather than China or even on Taiwan. But, expect other outsourcing to shift, maybe away from China and towards Southeast Asia. I mean, these things are always in flux anyway. I mean, if you know the history of, I don't know, the shoe industry, for example, as costs changed, shoe production shifted from Boston to the Carolinas to Mexico and to China. And now it's probably, I'm going to guess, it's going to shift to Southeast Asia, to Vietnam and Cambodia and so forth, where it can be done cheaper. And now finally, and I have to say sadly, economic stagnation and shortages may lead to social turmoil and hopefully not, but possibly violence. I mean, more violence than just the Ukraine war. You might recall that the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011 started with rioters protesting high food prices, which came from a drought in the steppes of Russia and Ukraine back in 2011. I mean, how bad could it get? Well, I mean, think Venezuela of 2017, where the population reportedly lost an average of 24 pounds per person. Only maybe on a larger scale. I'm not predicting this will happen, but modern day famine is not out of the question. All right, so that's bad. That's not a prediction. Again, that's a dire circumstance, which I hope does not happen. Okay, now just kind of to wrap up. Did President Biden and his advisors choose to fight the Russians with the dollar because they thought that the only alternative to that, which would have been a bad one, was sending American children to die in Ukraine? I mean, those were not his only options. But we have to wonder, did he really carefully consider all the potential collateral damage, not just to the Russians, but to Americans and to our trading partners around the world? My answer is probably not. Probably not. And we can only hope for, saner people and sounder minds in the future when we get to a new election cycle. All right. So with that, I am going to call it a wrap and see how we're doing on time. Oh, boy, that was longer than I thought. Anyway, you can see me here. I recently had another essay published in Capitalism Magazine, Monetary Cancel Culture. And you can see me on Substack or Twitter or LinkedIn. Daniel, any final chats or questions or comments?
Yes, we have two more super chat. One is from Stephen Lamb. Thank you for $5. And he says, if there is a scheduling conflict with Elizabeth Warren, maybe AOC can pitch in.
I'm going to work on those. I think I could probably put together a really nice interview with with an AOC sit-in, a surrogate maybe, and it might be very, very entertaining. I'll see what I can do, Steve. Thank you.
And also from Jeff Bannister, thank you for $10 Canadian. Would you consider the lockdowns of some small businesses while big box stores remained open a form of sanctions to make us comply?
Yeah, they were certainly forcible legal sanctions, I think, but they weren't necessarily banking sanctions. these people probably, in those cases, still had access to their bank accounts. So it's a little outside my strict area of interest, but they were definitely, making exceptions for the big box stores, but now not allowing little stores to open was definitely an arbitrary, discriminatory sanction that did great damage to them. I know of a person who has a good business, a couple of good businesses up in Napa, in the Bay Area, and she told me that somehow the candy store was considered an essential business and was allowed to stay open, but her art gallery was closed down. Now that's pretty arbitrary, but yes, that's a very good point.
And one more super chat from Stephen Lamb. Thank you for $10. I'll sponsor the show for you. Joking aside, thanks for the show. They are helpful.
Good to hear from you, Steve. Thank you.
And
all right, so let's call that a wrap. We're just about out of time. Thank you very much for your time, attention, and contributions and support of ARC UK. And I will see you again in the next week or two. I have several more of these presentations to do, and I look forward to them. Thank you.